Hello, my name is Max Williams. I'm still doing the motion breakdowns for round 6. I don't know if most people are going to watch both. I just did the other one, so I'll mix things up. There won't be overlap or anything, but I'll still do a personal introduction just in case some people are only watching this one. So, as I said, my name is Max. I'm originally from Edmonton, Alberta. I've been debating for about 9 years now. I like debate. I like meeting people through debate. I met a lot of my friends through debate, my girlfriend through debate. I like to travel around. I like to argue a lot. It's a great activity, as I'm sure you all know. And what else? Oh yeah, my accolades. I debated a lot in high school. I was on Team Canada. I won this tournament in 2021. I won Harvard Worlds in 2021 as well, I think. And I kept going in university. So I don't know how much about university debate is proliferated down to the high school circuit, but I broke at the round robin, I broke at Worlds, if you know those tournaments. So I've been doing it for some time. Today we're just going to take a look at this motion here. So what I want to do is I want to first start with some general advice on a motion like this. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the rules. Thirdly, I want to talk a bit about the arguments you might want to run on either side. So let's start with general advice. So this is a social movements motion. There's going to be some overlap here with the last motion that was also about a social movement. What's important to keep in mind here is one, that the LGBTQ plus activist movement, there are certainly discrete groups within this general kind of coalition of people working towards the same political ends, but there's not one big group with an organized leadership structure that dictates things to members who are formally a part. And that means that we have to be really careful about the means of influence in this debate. So how is it that these activists actually get change? Well, they don't get change like the government gets change by just passing laws or spending money. They have to persuade people, convince people to do things, whether that's their own members, whether that's people outside of their movement, whether it's people in allied kind of groups. They have to work that way. So we want to keep that in mind because, as I said in the other video, a common problem in a motion like this is trying to prove too much, right? So, the non-Western context that we're talking about here is a very culturally conservative context in a lot of instances, and the decisions that these activists make, while important in a local way, are not going to flip everything around overnight. They're not the only thing that goes into politics in these regions, especially because here we're just talking about one priority that this one political actor has. And so we want to have a realistic expectation of what could be accomplished by prioritizing one thing over the other. The last thing that I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that make this motion a bit distinct from the other round 6 motion. So firstly, should acts, so in this case we have the non-Western LGBTQ plus activists, should acts do A or B? This is a kind of common motion type, and in this motion type I really want to stress that the points of comparison between the two objectives are the whole debate. And it often feels like when I'm listening or judging rounds like this, that they somehow kind of take a back seat and teams talk maybe more generally about just why socioeconomic rights are important in the abstract, which is not really what we're supposed to be arguing about here, right? So what I really want to insist on is your arguments need to be comparative throughout in a motion like this, and whatever the point of difference is that you've identified, that's the thing that you really want to be weighing up over the other team and stressing is important in your framing and your impacting. So we want to keep that in mind, be comparative throughout, weigh your chosen point of, let's say, distinction. Okay, that's my general advice. Rule stuff for a motion like this. So this is very tricky. I really want to kind of get this across clearly because it's such an easy trap to fall into. Normally, if a motion is written THBT, that means that the motion is, I think they're conventionally called analysis motions. And what that means is that the government team doesn't get to decide how this prioritization looks. They have to explain what it would likely look like given the world as it is now. So if in real life these activists tried to prioritize socioeconomic rights, how would they do it? So a question to answer there might be, how much would they prioritize this over civil liberties? So it would be like a 60-40 resource kind of split, an 80-20 resource kind of split. And then you might ask questions like, what socioeconomic rights would they go for first? When would they stop prioritizing this and take an equal approach or switch to civil liberties? So these questions can't just be fiated in a normal this House believes that motion by the government team. And the opposition team likewise can't counter fiat what these activists would be doing if they didn't do this prioritization. However, this is a special type of this House believes that motion. This House believes that X, or X is just the actor, should do Y. In a motion like this is the same as this House would, functionally. But it's a little bit different, right? Because in this case, you're only able to fiat what the activists will do. You can't say the government is going to do something, but it's functionally the same. And so you just want to be aware that you do have fiat here as OG and counter fiat as OL. So you should be thinking strategically about if you want to model, what to put in the model, if you want to counter model, what to put in the counter model, something to be aware of, especially for future rounds. Okay, let's move into the substance and try to talk over some different arguments that could be run here. So once again, I'll just say this is an open-ended motion, right? There's a lot of room for creativity on a social movements motion like this because there are so many different kind of ways that you could say this is going to work out. So it could help the movement in a way that's totally unrelated to these two particular struggles. It could be that it helps with one struggle more than the other. It could be one struggle is more important than the other, more durable than the other. It could affect just how these activists are perceived by, let's say, sympathetic people in the Western world. It could affect how they're perceived by their government, even if they're no more successful or even less successful at doing one than the other. And so there's a million different things that you can say on this motion. I'm just going to try to give a little sample of what both sides might want to say, and then work through one argument in depth to give you a sense for how you might go about constructing an argument on this motion. Okay, so let's start with government. So here we have a few ideas. So one point of distinction we might have is that this is less likely to be resisted. So that's the point of comparison we're making here. We're saying if you try to get socioeconomic rights, not as many people will oppose you in these countries as will oppose you if you try to get civil liberties. So why would that be the case? I think the essence of the argument here is that the origin of discrimination against LGBTQ plus people originates around relationships and sexuality. And so when we're thinking about rights that are immediately connected to relationship and sexuality, so the right to marry somebody of the same sex, the right to adopt a child as a same-sex couple, these are issues that are more related to whatever hang-ups people in non-Western countries have about LGBTQ plus people already than socioeconomic rights. So it's one thing to say that the institution of marriage should be broadened beyond the man-female couple. It's another thing to say that people who are working, regardless of their orientation, should not be discriminated against for personal choices. So that's kind of the idea. Now, secondly, we might say that it is easier to fit in with a broad coalition if you are going after socioeconomic rights. So the idea here is that if we just again kind of look at these examples, is it the case that there are other groups in society that have an interest in raising the salience of who is allowed to get married? Is it the case that there are other groups in society that really want landmark legislation changing how marriage works? None really come to mind for me. I'm sure there are examples, but it just doesn't seem like an obvious thing that lots of other groups are also looking for. But if we look at these socioeconomic rights, so employment equality, anti-workplace discrimination, these are concerns that the LGBTQ plus community shares with women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities. All of these groups have an interest in not letting the majority discriminate against them in hiring and treat them poorly once they are hired. So, it's easier to work in a politically effective way if you have common interests with these groups. Now, you have to be a little careful here, right? The interest is not exactly common because you could write a law that says you can't discriminate against women, but discriminating against gay people is fine. So the interests don't have to overlap. They're just they naturally overlap in the sense that both groups want to be talking about the same thing. They're going to raise similar arguments about fairness, about meritocracy, and so on. And once you've got the structure set up for one group, it's easy to cross-apply to another group, right? So once we pass the Civil Rights Act one time and we say you can't discriminate against women here, we have all the architecture in place to make that a reality also, let's say, for sexual orientation. Okay. The last thing I had for Gov is just you can pursue this in a way where there are more intermediate achievements. So an intermediate achievement means, let's say that we, achieve a degree of success that is not over a critical tipping point. So in this case, the critical tipping point is probably like national legislation. So, most priorities of activists never make it into national legislation. They fail at some point before that. So the question is going to be then, the point of distinction is going to be then, let's say that this push does fail or fails for a long time. What if you do an okay job? Do you get anything out of that? So I think the simple argument here is just it's easier to see how you would secure socioeconomic rights in localized contexts than it is that you would secure civil liberties in localized contexts. For the simple reason that a lot of this stuff is administered by a fairly high level of government, right? So the marriage registry, adoption, the ownership of property title and deed, that's all overseen by the government. For the first two, I'm pretty sure it would be the highest level of government, the national or federal government. Ownership of properties, maybe a bit more variance. But what that means is you're going to have to change the mind of that government, which has a lot of priorities, a lot of things to worry about, to get anything done. Whereas with socioeconomic rights, if you change the approach of a particular labor union in terms of how it's going to advocate at negotiations with the employer about ending workplace discrimination or about hiring equality, once you change that union's position, you don't have to change every other union's country in the position every other union in the country's position on the issue to get some return for the people who are working with that union. It's the same way if you negotiate directly with an employer, if you do a boycott or consumer pressure campaign, if you target companies that mostly market in urban, well-educated areas that tend to be more liberal. These are all ways in which you can pursue limited socioeconomic rights and get some mileage out of your advocacy, even if it's just not really feasible to get change done for the entire country. Okay, now let's look at some ideas for opposition. So one idea here is that we could say it's more likely to be resisted. So you'll notice that in motions like these, often you can just run the exact opposite of what the other side says, and that's a plausible idea as well. So here I think the logic is going to be, and we're going to explore this a little bit more, that there are more reasons if you're just a heterosexual person or an entity, let's say like a corporation, there's more reason to oppose socioeconomic expansions of rights than civil liberties being expanded. A second idea is that this makes further changes easier. So you can kind of see this with marriage equality to some extent in the United States. It's a very high-profile change. It's a symbolic change that puts everybody kind of on the same level. Once you've achieved a major symbolic victory, the question that you can kind of always ask is, if we are equal in this respect, how is this other respect different? Now, the reason that the kind of symbolic change is important is because marriage is a bright line rule, right? It's just banned for same-sex couples to get married in many countries. And once you change that bright line rule for everybody, it's easy to point to that and say marriage, which is a super important part of many people's lives, is like this. It works in an equal way. Why does it work that way in the workplace? Whereas in a way, because the socioeconomic rights are not bright line, so did this particular employer discriminate against me in this context? Well, I have to bring that to court and figure it out, and there's going to be some balancing tests, some factors, and some discretion. It's harder to say that a success in that area is as definitive, maybe. I don't love that argument, actually, now that I'm thinking about it more. Let me put a little asterisk there. But you could say it. A third thing you could say is easier legal enforcement. So that kind of relates to what I was saying already, which is just, in a lot of cases, these are just administrative changes that are easy to swap, whereas cultural problems make it a lot harder to enforce socioeconomic rights. So if it is legal for two people of the same sex to marry each other, you just have to find one clerk who's willing to approve your marriage, and the rule is very clear. Whereas there's lots of room for employers to point to other factors for why they fired somebody or didn't hire somebody. And if the whole country tends to be polarized or predisposed against the LGBTQ plus community, you get an unfavorable judge. It's hard to enforce your rights, even if you get them. Fourthly, maybe you get more Western support. So the idea here is just because the marriage equality thing was such a big deal in Western countries, and because Western countries are so rich and so influential, if you make your activist campaign about something that was really important in these other contexts, people will have an easier time drawing analogies between the struggle in their country and the struggle in your country. They'll be more willing to donate, and the government will look better with its people. I'm saying the government, the Western government, will look better with its people if it does something to help you out. And then, 1 second here. Last but not least, we might just say something like, it's more important. So an idea here might be, obviously it's not ideal, but there's no reason you have to disclose your sexuality just to work at a job or to interview somewhere. And obviously it would be much better if you could disclose that. It would relieve a lot of stress. It would let you be open with your partner if you have one. But you don't have to, right? And so you could, in theory, at least for most people in the LGBTQ plus movement, probably just live a completely normal life without socioeconomic rights, or not completely normal, but normal in the economic respect, where you're not going to be discriminated against in hiring, you're not going to be harassed in the workplace. Whereas if you're thinking about like marriage equality, if you're thinking about adoption, it's not really possible for you to just stay in the closet if you want to do these things. And so it perhaps matters relatively more that there's a legal change in these areas. Okay, so those are a bunch of ideas. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, just some stuff to think about. There are lots of other points of comparison you could run. Remember, for any one of these that you run, you probably want to do some weighing of that point of distinction. I just want to now walk through start to finish this idea here briefly to show you how you might approach an argument, and that will kind of close us off. So the first thing we might want to prove here, in the other video I did a question format. Here I might just do proving various helpful propositions. So we might start by saying civil liberties being expanded does not materially burden heterosexual people. So why is that the case? We might say, as a category, this is about how people order their own lives. So normally, when we're thinking about civil liberties like the right to marriage, that's a principle of how you can organize your own life, what relationships you can engage with, maybe if you can have children in the case of adoption. And it doesn't bring people who aren't consenting to be involved into the equation. Whereas if we kind of jump ahead, and here we're going to be comparative when we deliver the argument, socioeconomic rights do present such burdens. And why is that the case? Because this category is about how people can be treated by others in the economy. And so if one category of rights, as we can see from the example, is mostly about how you manage your own affairs with people who want to be involved with you. So even with the example of ownership of property, that doesn't mean anybody else loses their property. It just means if somebody wants to sell a gay person property, they can list the ownership in the gay person's name. This is not something, obviously heterosexual people might not like it, but it doesn't directly make their lives worse, and they don't think that it makes their lives worse. Now, again, it's always a question of margin, right? There's an extent to which you can convince people that something that doesn't really materially affect them, in fact, does, if you have a hostile enough media. But the question is, to what extent can you do that relative to a place where there are real burdens? So what are the real burdens down here? We could just go through the examples. So if we have a situation where there's employment equality, which I'm just taking to mean that when you're hiring people, or deciding whether somebody gets promoted or things like that, you're not allowed to consider their sexual orientation as a negative factor of a reason not to hire them if they're qualified. So if you just think about it, people perceive jobs, firstly, as extremely important, but secondly, in a sort of zero-sum way. So if we're all competing for one promotion, one open position, and suddenly we're making it easier for this new class of people to get that position, it's harder for me to compete to get that opportunity. And that's something that does worry people in a very direct way. I mean, there's an analogy to immigration here that I think is helpful. It does make people worry on a personal level about these rights being expanded. It's kind of the same for workplace harassment, where who is the workplace harassment law going to be enforced against? Well, it's going to be enforced against companies who don't do enough to create or address a toxic work environment, and they're going to be fined or penalized in some way. So the companies don't want to expand rights in that way. And the people who are actually doing the harassment are going to be other employees or your superiors. And so people are going to worry, well, maybe they say they really are bigoted, they worry that the behavior is outlawed now. But if they're not bigoted, they might worry, maybe I will get caught up in an investigation about this anyway. Right? People had a lot of the same worries about Me Too, where just because a small number of very famous men are being accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault, suddenly all these men who are not celebrities at all and have no real reason to think anybody would want to Me Too them are suddenly worried about the problem. And so you can kind of see how there's a difference in category with respect to the examples that leads to a difference in how other people react to the proposal by these activists that, hey, we should get an expansion of rights in this area. So we want to close this comparison. I think we've kind of shown what the comparison is, what the difference is. Now we just want to show why that's important. So why is it important that we will face less opposition to expanding civil liberties? So the first thing to say is it's hard to do anything in these countries with substantial opposition. So what that means is, if people really don't want something to happen in a democracy, which most countries in the world are, to varying extents democratic today, it's very hard to accomplish anything as a minority. And these countries obviously do have populations that are willing to exercise that substantial opposition because they're maybe deeply socially conservative for religious reasons. There's low educational attainment in a lot of these areas. There are very traditional values that have persisted because the economy hasn't modernized, the culture hasn't we could say the culture hasn't liberalized. And that means that if people feel like this is a threat to them, there are definitely enough of them to make that a huge problem for the activists. Whereas just a little opposition, even from a lot of people, is not so bad. And the reason that this is true is just in a democracy, you only cast one vote. So people have a lot of different things they want to vote on. They want to vote on issues of governance, right? So corruption issues, democratization issues. They want to vote on economic issues. And so if their preferred candidate is their preferred candidate because they think he will be better for the economy or some other reason, the question is knowing that this candidate is on board with gay marriage enough to make you switch your vote? And so if these people think, well, I would prefer that doesn't happen, but it's not going to directly affect me, then perhaps they cast the vote anyway. So that's kind of transforming this difference into something that's going to show up in the policy landscape. And the last thing that we want to say here is, why is this change important? Firstly, more change equals better. That's an obvious idea. But secondly, some change makes other change easier. So the idea here is that oftentimes criticisms of advances in these ways are related, in that if people see that one expansion of rights to LGBTQ plus people doesn't actually turn out really poorly, they're more willing to favor other expansions of rights in other areas because they're less willing to extend the same credibility to people who told them the first thing wouldn't work out. So if we can get changes in the civil liberties area, and nobody notices any real material burden, and nobody notices their life getting worse, then that can be the fuel that these activist groups need to secure other changes later on. Now you might want to do some more stuff with this argument, like you might want to try to find some intermediate impacts in here that you could get without wholesale change. So for example, in Israel, Tel Aviv allows same-sex civil unions, even though Israel as a whole, I'm not sure if my understanding of this is still up to date, but at one time this was true. Israel doesn't allow gay marriage. And that's an example of an intermediate impact that you could secure. Maybe in this one more liberal part of a country we can get a change, even if we can't get a change in the rest. Stuff like that you could add, but that's the rough layout. Okay, I hope this was helpful. Again, have a great tournament if that's still happening, or if it's not, I hope you had a great tournament. Take care. Bye.